we look at students whose first language is not English and the challenges that they face. These are postgraduate students. So most of them are international to South Africa, and that means I would say 95% of them are from other African countries. So English isn't their first language, it's sometimes not even their second language. And these students have particular challenges just moving around on our campus in everyday terms, but they also have particular challenges in terms of using the language of their discipline and then in disseminating their research. So we are doing some focus groups and interviews with these students to hear what are their coping strategies and how can the university better support them in order to develop their communication and writing skills in English.
So I'm a historian, and one of the things I am very interested in history is visual sources. So I teach about the 1950s and 1960s in the United States, and images from the civil rights movement, for example, are really powerful. They were powerful at the time, they remain powerful now. And so as I brought more and more images into my courses, I sort of assumed my students would understand how to read those images and how to make sense of those images as historical texts. And I found that my assumption wasn't accurate. Students who were pretty skilled, upper-level history students, pretty skilled at reading text-based historical sources, somewhat like historians do, read many images just like they'd read a newspaper or a fashion magazine. They'd sort of look at the picture and say, isn't it pretty? And they'd move on. And so I did a long project trying to understand how students make sense of images as visual sources. So what I did is I developed, working with a number of colleagues, a series of in-class activities where students would be given a set of images that were related, but they didn't necessarily know much about. And I asked them to analyze the images to try to describe what they saw in them, to then speculate about what that meant and when the image was taken and where it was created and why it was created, and to ascribe some meaning to it. And then I added a question that came out of Sam Weinberg's work. He's a psychologist at Stanford who studies how people learn history. And so I added this question, and I asked my students to rank the sources that I'd given them from the most valuable as a historical source to the least valuable as a historical source. And honestly, I did that because I read an article by Weinberg. I thought it was an interesting set of questions. I didn't think I was going to find anything interesting there. And that ended up producing some of the most valuable insights, because what that did is it gave me a window into how many of my students were confused about images as sources. What they tend to do is assume that pictures, photographs are true, and in a way that they don't assume texts are true, for example. So they would look at an image from a newspaper, and they would just say, that is true. If they looked at an editorial from a newspaper, they would say, I wonder who wrote this. I wonder what the bias of the author in the newspaper is. Why did it appear in the newspaper when it did? But the picture was just true. And so what that all led me to do over a number of years is back up when I'm introducing images as sources to students, and have them prompting my students to think about, what do we know about images and how true are they, and how are they constructed in ways that are similar to or different than texts we might encounter. And once my students start thinking about that, then they're capable of reading images more like historians do. But if we don't get to those assumptions about the truth of images, I wasn't able to get my students to really analyze images like historical sources.
It was really multinational and multi-institutional project. And our project was around the writing transfer and the teaching of writing pedagogy in a foreign language, and also the switch or the changes that occur when students switch from one language to another, and what is that can be transferable and what is not, or what does a good transfer mean in this case as opposed to bad transfer. So that was our project.